This video series explores the seminars of Jacques Lacan. I don't claim to be presenting some definitive understanding of Lacan, but will be exposing you to my own process of working through his thought, trying to unpack central ideas found in the text. Please subscribe and feel free to provide comments and questions below in response to these videos. In the last video, we considered the aim of psychoanalysis being the reconstitution of the subject's history. We also distinguished psychoanalysis, as Lacan conceives of it, from forms of psychotherapy that may be broadly classified as ego psychologies. In today's video, we'll be discussing Lecture 2 of Seminar 1 in the section entitled The Moment of Resistance, covering pages 19 to 28 in the English translation. When considering psychoanalytic technique, it's often difficult to discern from his writings alone exactly what techniques Freud used, or at least exactly how he employed them. Rather than being incidentally left unsaid, there may have been some intention behind this. Freud was on a path that deviates from the typical use of technique. For technique, and especially the analysis of technique, often imbibes in a kind of objective and objectifying method. What Freud was after was a different kind of knowledge, and his method can't be reduced to a set of techniques. Rather than the objective truth of science, Freud was concerned with the realization of the truth of the subject, to quote Lacan. This makes psychoanalysis a rather distinct kind of science, one in which the truth is located in the experience of the particular, unique instance of the case. To be sure, analysis as a science is always a science of the particular. The coming to fruition of an analysis is always a unique case, even if these unique cases lend themselves all the same to some generality, since there is more than one analyst. But with Freud, the analytic experience represents uniqueness carried to its limit from the fact that he was in the process of building and verifying analysis itself. Remember what we discussed in the last video about singularity. We're not talking about personality. We're not referring to that trend of individual uniqueness found in contemporary society, where everyone is seeking to stand out apart from everyone else, a sort of self-branding that we see among many, especially on social media. What is singular is the subject's history, which goes beyond the limits of the individual. From here, Lacan begins reflecting upon the materialist, pseudo-anatomical metaphors Freud employs in his studies on hysteria, namely the ideational nucleus that forms the core of symptoms. Such a nucleus, for Freud, represents a concatenation of pathogenic trains of thought. Lacan interprets this as suggesting a concrete materialization of speech, or giving speech its own reality. How so? Where does speech enter in here? We find the closest approximation in Freud's studies on hysteria, where he proposes that around the pathogenic nucleus is a kind of arrangement of thought contents linked together in an irregular twisting path, organized in a logical chain that travels in roundabout paths from the surface to the deepest layers and back again. If Freud was really addressing speech here, why not make it more explicit? According to Lacan, Freud lacked the conceptual means for articulating this materiality of speech, writing before the rise of structural linguistics that came to shape Lacan's thought. Would Freud have had these concepts in hand, Lacan believes, he would have considered the succession of phonemes as forming that twisting logical chain. This chain is linked not like an unfolding of an argument, but by a series of substitutions encapsulated by the rather stale joke that when you say one thing, you mean your mother. We'll return to this idea of phonemic substitutions in a later video. In traveling down this twisting chain, we begin to confront resistance, which functions as a positive, repulsive force expressed by this pathogenic nucleus. But what is this resistance? Perhaps it may be surprising to discover that resistance is linked to the ego itself. But didn't I just say that resistance is expressed by the pathogenic nucleus? Indeed, and there's no contradiction here. For the dominant mass of ideas constituting the ego is that pathogenic nucleus. Referring back to the first lecture, Lacan states, "At the heart of the subject, the ego is only a privileged symptom, the human symptom par excellence, the mental illness of man." Now, how does speech come into play here? We have to keep in mind what resistance means in the context of psychoanalytic treatment. Here, resistance principally refers to the breaking of the fundamental rule of free association, that the analysand must say whatever comes to mind and not seek to hold anything back, regardless of how irrelevant or nonsensical it may seem. The ego as resistance then represents the limit of speech, the sum of silences, and thus is what violates this fundamental rule. But rather than think of resistance as merely what the analysand would be guilty of, a more fundamental resistance belongs to the analyst, expressed as counter-transference. Counter-transference, according to Lacan, is nothing other than the function of the analyst's ego, what I have called the sum total of the analyst's prejudices. This happens principally in the manner in which the analyst positions themselves in relation to the analysand, characterized as a dual relationship whereby the analyst's ego relates to the analysand's ego. It was what Lacan called in the first lecture a two-body psychology, leaving out the third element, which is speech itself. Such a dual relationship is marked by illusions of reciprocity. It's for this reason you may hear Lacanian analysts today be highly critical of what is called relational psychoanalysis, to the degree that such an orientation places emphasis on interpersonal relations rather than impersonal structures and drives. Countertransference, which is sometimes thought of by relational analysts as a potential source of useful therapeutic material to be judiciously disclosed, is for Lacan always an obstacle to progress in psychoanalytic treatment. Not only is resistance a problem for the individual psyche, whether analysands or analysts, it also represents an impasse for the psychoanalytic community, and herein reveals the double meaning of this section's title, The Moment of Resistance. Lacan's both discussing resistances of the ego in analysis and resistances of institutions to the core of Freud's teaching, especially through their apotheosis of the ego. Make no mistake about it, the ego is not what needs strengthening, but is the problem. Part of the difficulty in theorizing about the ego is that it is often nominalized, forming some component of the psyche, whereas in fact, the ego is a function or activity of that psyche. And in this case, it's the binding and jamming up of these thought contents. One sees something similar in Heidegger's concern toward the treatment of being as a noun rather than a verb. The thingification of the ego prevents us from seeing it clearly for what it is. Here are the central ideas covered in today's video. 1. Psychoanalysis is a science of the particular, and its truth is located in the singularity of the subject. 2. The source of symptoms are centered around a pathogenic nucleus, which is formed by a knot of thought contents that Lacan interprets as the materiality of speech. 3. The pathogenic nucleus is the ego itself, which is the source of resistance to speech. 4. Such resistance does not belong merely to the analysand, but also, and perhaps principally, to the analyst through countertransference. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.